Well, good morning. Welcome to Mental Health Monday, July 29th. Our guest presenter today is Andrew Dean. We're going to be talking about the potential for psychedelics in treating mental health, and recognizing that it's important to proceed with caution. And just to say a few words about Andrew. He's the founder and executive director of Citizens for Psychedelics. It's a 501c4 nonprofit dedicated to advocating for legislation that promotes research, funding, and broader access to psychedelic-assisted therapy. CFP focuses on advancing legislation that would broaden access to psychedelic medications that can assist in treating mental health conditions such as substance use, anxiety, treatment-resistant depression, PTSD, and others. Andrew is a U.S. Air Force veteran and entrepreneur. He launched the CFP out of frustration when the limited research on alternative and plant-based medicines for mental health treatment with regard to that. And after conducting extensive research on psychedelics and their potential therapeutic benefits, he mobilized CFP, collaborating with researchers, first responders, veterans, psychologists, to advocate for policy change in Arizona. Their efforts contributed to the passage of HB 2105, securing $5 million in research grants for a phase 1 psilocybin research program. CFP's mission is grounded in the belief that advancing alternative therapies requires rigorous research to demonstrate their efficacy and safety. I apologize for the dog that's making noise in the background. Andrew, are you able to share your screen, or do I need to make you a co-host to do that?
Oh, it says host is disabled screen sharing.
Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and make you a co-host, and that will give you access to that. And if you'd like to expand on your introduction, please do.
Okay, I think you pretty much nailed the introduction. So I mean, I'll just pull this up and we can just kind of jump into it. I do have a PowerPoint here. I'll try not to just read from the PowerPoint, but I wanted to at least have it, so especially for those that are, when it's being recorded, for those that are going to watch later, then the information can be up there and they can reference back to it. Yeah, and then like Lori said, feel free to just interrupt as needed if you have questions or anything. We'll just get them answered as they pop up. That works for everybody. And then let's see. So did the screen show up? Can everyone see it now?
Yeah, we can see the screen.
Okay, perfect. So like Lori discussed, we are a 501c4 nonprofit. We started in January of this year, so we're really new, but we've been able to make significant headway in what we're trying to do. We did begin out of a frustration of lack of research being performed on psychedelics. You know, so we wanted to start something that we could start pushing for legislation, start getting money available for research, and start pushing forward this movement of using psychedelics for mental health therapy. As Lori talked about, we've been fairly successful so far. We were able to get HB 2105 passed through the legislature. That was actually a technical correction bill on a previous bill that had been submitted. And all that did was secure $5 million to make that funding non-lapsing. The way that it was originally written, the funds were going to go back into the general budget fund in well, they would have gone back in June of this last year. So we were able to extend that out to 2026. So now the research laboratories have until 2026 to complete their phase 1 study and still be compensated. That money, that bill awarded $5 million. $3 million of it went to the Scottsdale Research Institute, who is headed up by Dr. Sue Sisley. I don't know if anybody is familiar with her. And then about $1 million was donated, or not donated, but granted to the University of Arizona. And then there's still about $1 million left in the fund. And as of Tuesday of last week, the Arizona Biomedical Research Board had opened that funding, opened that grant up to future applicants. And so if there are other study whole mushroom psilocybin, emphasis being whole mushroom psilocybin, that is still, there's still $1 million left in funding for that. So I don't know if the existing grantees will be eventually given more money for that, or it'll just end up going back in the general fund. I think that's still left to be determined by the Biomedical Research Board. And then just so you guys are aware too, and I'll send out a thing to Lori, a document to Lori that kind of has a list of links that you guys can use for different research on different psychedelics, and then just some things that are help keep everybody apprised of what's going on with the psychedelics movement, as far as like with the Arizona Biomedical Research Board and some of the other issues that are going on at the legislature. And that way you guys could check in as things progress and stay in tune if you so desire. So we do look to pave the way for psychedelics. We want to make sure that we're doing that by advocating for research. The most important thing to us is we want to make sure that that anything that we're putting out in the public is, one, first and foremost, safe for participants in studies, or safe for patients, and that it's effective. I don't think I need to tell anybody on the call that having another ineffective form of therapy is the answer to anything. So we want to make sure that what we're pushing forward is effective and safe to use for the public. The biggest thing for us is making sure that we understand the science around psychedelics. There's limited research at this point, so we want to make sure that that we're doing the proper research, making sure that we understand what we're trying to push forward. We want to make sure that we're educating the public, which we're doing by having meetings like this, and then using what we've learned and input from the public to advocate for policies that make sure that what we're doing is safe, and that it makes sense for the people that need these medicines. So, and then if we do all that, we feel that will help heal the people in the community, and create a positive thing going forward. So, our biggest thing that sure that we dismantle the stigma around psychedelics. I think everybody, not everybody, but a large portion of the general public has a negative connotation when it comes to psychedelics. There's a lot of misunderstanding on what they do, how they're taken, what happens when they're taken. And so I think by having meetings like this, we can kind of get some new information out to the public, and eliminate some of that stigma. The biggest thing I think that comes out is the biggest thing or question we get or thing presented to us is a couple of things. One is that all psychedelics create these large hallucinations, and that anybody takes psychedelics is going to be off their rocker by taking them, and they're going to be out of the loop. And that's just simply not true. That does happen. That happens typically in very large doses that most people would be very uncomfortable taking. But just like any drug, you take a large enough amount of it, or any substance, you take a large enough amount of it, you're going to have negative side effects from that. So the biggest thing is not all these drugs well, none of these drugs really cause large hallucinations or significant changes in demeanor in therapeutic use. When you start getting into large doses, that's when you start seeing some of the negative effects of a lot of these psychedelics, which there are very few in most psychedelics. There are some psychedelics that have problematic issues, and we'll talk about some of that later.
So Andrew, this is Lori. I hear the term microdosing. And when you say, large amounts, but these tests and studies are being done would the term be microdose?
Yes, microdosing has become very popular, a popular term, and has become a very effective, popular way of administering psychedelics. So, so microdosing is probably the most popular form right now, and I think that's because you know, a lot of these drugs are available to the public on the black or gray market, and it's kind of a way it's become popular because it is just that. It's a dose that you don't get these like extreme psychedelic effects from. It's something that you can take that's more akin to like a ibuprofen or a Tylenol, where you kind of take the drug and then it operates in the background. You don't really notice a significant change, but people do report having elevated moods, less anxiety, things to that nature. So microdosing is probably the most popular form of taking psychedelics at the current time. And it's kind of a relatively new method of taking psychedelics. So you are correct. That is probably the most popular thing right now.
So another question I have is you're using the term psychedelics, and when we introduced, we used the term, well, mentioned psilocybin specifically. Maybe you're going to get into it later in the presentation, but when you say psychedelics, can you tell us which ones you're referring to?
Yeah, we are going to get into some more of the psychedelics, or the psychedelics that I wanted to kind of talk about today. The ones that I want to talk about today are for the most part, the main psychedelics that are being discussed and researched. Now, you talk about psychedelics, there's you know, kind of a core group, but all of that core group has different iterations, hundreds of iterations, and different chemical formats and things like that. The big psychedelics that I wanted to talk to you about today were psilocybin, or most people know them as magic mushrooms or mushrooms, LSD or acid, which some people know it as. Another one that I really like is ibogaine, which is used primarily in addiction treatment. And then there's some other drugs that are called dissociatives, such as ketamine, that we'll cover as well, which I imagine everybody's probably heard of most of those, with the exception of ibogaine, which is a fairly obscure psychedelic that has a lot of potential when it comes to substance use disorders and substance use treatments, but particularly with opioids. So, but we will get into those, and I'll kind of talk about each one and where they were started from, and then kind of their effects and what they're being used for. So get us into this. So psychedelics, drugs. So the two things we'll talk about today, I wanted to talk about, are psychedelics and dissociatives. I personally, Citizens for Psychedelics, we are geared towards more towards psychedelics in the true sense of the word, and less towards dissociatives. We typically, psychedelics are more natural, not always. There's some that are unnatural, but most of them derive from plants, just like most medicines, to be honest. But they're taken in their plant form, typically. So we'll focus mostly on psychedelics and what their use is, because as that's where we're kind of focused. We have our energy focused. Psychedelics are drugs that influence the brain process the chemical serotonin. When it comes to mental health treatment, I think that's fairly atypical kind of thing to affect in the brain. That's what most mental health drugs affect, are the serotonin levels in the brain. Psychedelics that we're going to talk about, like we talked about, or that we mentioned before: magic mushrooms, LSD, DMT to a little bit, ibogaine, and mescaline. We won't really talk much about DMT or mescaline today. They're a little more obscure and have less, are not really being researched as much for mental health uses, but they do exist out there. So mainly psychedelics interact with the 5-HT receptors in the brain. Like we talked about, they are the neurotransmitters in the brain that handle serotonin. And like we also mentioned, that's typically the target for psychotherapeutic drugs. So we also don't want to put out there that we know everything about these. There's a ton of research that needs to be done. As we try to push any treatment forward, we need to make sure that we are doing research, and making sure that the research is thorough, that it's covered all the bases, and that it is in fact safe, and that we know how it operates. So we're not just putting another substance out on the market that's going to cause harm or cause damage to the people that use it. So where did I lose my track here? All these, they typically affect the prefrontal cortex, affecting mood, cognition, and perception. And so there's a lot of talk out there where basically a lot of the research is based around how psychedelics interact with these receptors. There's there's studies that say that they create a neuroplasticity or kind of rewire the way that the neurons fire. There's, you know, some, which that's where you get into some of this, what they call this default mode network. So they it's kind of like some psychedelics, typically in large dose use. So there is, we talked about microdose. There's two types of use. There's microdose and then macro, what they call a macro dose. The microdose, like we talked about, works in small levels and operates in the background. Where a macro dose, you can get into what we talked about with some of the hallucinations, auditory hallucinations, visual hallucinations, things to that nature. But they're also said to do or the theory is in large doses that they also kind of reset the neurons to get them, kind of fire them up working again. And that's where this region calls it default mode network. Now, I also want to say I'm not a doctor, I'm not a researcher. Any of this information is all information that I've just studied over time. So I don't want anybody to think that my information is like the end all be all. And this is, you know, I like I said, I want to clarify that I'm not a doctor or a researcher. So none of this is advice in that sense. But they do, with the theory is that during macro doses, that it kind of shuts down all the neurons from firing and then refires them back up and gets them to operating in a way that they're supposed to be operating. Obviously, there needs to be a lot more research done on that to get a better understanding how that works. But that's the basic premise of this, and that's where most of the research is being geared, is how that rewiring works. But yeah. Does anybody have any questions so far?
It's sounding like ECT, you know, when you talk about rewiring and resetting.
Yeah. What is ECT? I'm unfamiliar with
Electric
that.
shock therapy.
Oh,
Yeah.
I hope it's more enjoyable than that sounds.
Yeah, yeah.
I think it's Lori, I think it's gonna be a lot less invasive than ECT.
No, absolutely. The only similarity was that it's like a reset button.
Yeah.
And Nicole works in a facility that does ketamine treatment.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, so she'll be familiar with the next part, the dissociative drugs. And again, I'm a little less familiar.
Andrew, you just froze on us.
So as a result, we have less information about them. But I wanted to throw this in here just so people knew. Dissociative drugs largely affect the NMDA receptors, and they're kind of the part of the brain system for transporting glutamate. I don't understand all the ins and outs of glutamate or what it does. They, like I have in here, they say it's a neurotransmitters for neurotransmitters, but it kind of operates with a lot of, I believe all neurotransmitters kind of operate with glutamate in some way, shape, or form. So, but I don't want to try to speak outside of my realm of knowledge on that. So, and like I said, we don't really typically deal with dissociative drugs. So we talked about a couple of different types of psychedelic drugs. A couple that I wanted to talk about and just kind of put out there. The first one, this was kind of the one that we're the biggest advocate of, and it's psilocybin or mushrooms. This has become probably the most popular and most talked about one in the last couple years. And I think mostly because it's probably the easiest one to come across, or easiest one to produce. Mushrooms could be grown in your home through like kits that you can get online. Their access has become very widespread compared to what it was 2 years ago. And the fact that it's a natural plant that can grow in the wild, it can grow in your garage, it provides a lot better access to it and a lot easier to get. And the benefits of it far outweigh any risks that it has been documented to have at this point. So So magic mushrooms, there's about 180 different species known species of mushrooms that have psychedelic compounds in them. Most of them they're found all throughout the world. There's not a continent, with the exception of Antarctica, that doesn't have psilocybin mushrooms. They can grow in a wide variety of climates, from the Pacific Northwest to the jungles of Central and South America to Southeast United States, throughout Europe, and throughout Africa as well, the continent of Africa as well. So they're all over the world. There's tons of different kinds, and now that they've become kind of mainstream and popular, you get these folks coming in they call themselves ethnobotanists, who are coming in and kind of making new and novel strains of different types of mushrooms by just some basic biology and combining things. They're like I said, they're all over. It's very, very prevalent throughout the world. They contain the psychedelic compounds known as psilocybin and psilocin. Psilocin is actually the chemical that causes is the psychedelic compound, or the one that will cause hallucinations or a difference in brain function. The way that works is you ingest the mushroom, it contains psilocybin, and then your body converts that to psilocin, which then starts to go to work on these 5-HT receptors, which are your serotonin receptors. And that's where you get the change in mood. The serotonin receptors, as you guys probably know, affect mood, cognition, and the way that they affect them, they also can create kind of a difference in your perception of reality, which is what causes your hallucinations and things to that in large doses. Ritually, they've been around for a long time. Mushrooms have been being used in South America in the Meso eras for thousands of years. There's evidence of them up to 6,000 years ago. They were first really written about by a Spanish priest that was doing work in South America with the Aztecs in the 16th century. He was the first to write about them and kind of first gain knowledge in the as a Westerner to gain knowledge of their use and what they were using them for. Obviously, there was more of a spiritual based use for those, and they've been using them in ceremonies, like I said, for thousands of years. Albert Hofmann was the first to identify the compound psilocybin. Albert Hofmann, we'll talk a little bit more about him later, is probably one of the most well-known psychedelic researchers in the history of the world, realistically. He was the first to discover psilocybin. He was the first to synthesize LSD. He was the first to propose studies of LSD. He used himself as a study candidate for. So he's a very big name. Very well-respected scientist. He lived to be well over 100 years old, I believe, and did psychedelic research pretty much right up to the day he died. But very well-known man when it comes to psychedelic industry. So psilocybin or magic mushrooms, I think most everybody knows they can cause auditory or visual hallucinations at high doses. I want to make sure we talk about that as when we talk about the hallucinations, that they are caused at high doses. And when I mean high doses, I mean fairly extreme high doses that most people would be uncomfortable with. I think there's a big part of the stigma associated with mushrooms or psychedelics in general is that anybody that takes them is going to be out of their mind. That it's kind of like what was that show or that movie they made back in I forget the name of it, in the 50s, but like Reefer Madness. I think Reefer Madness kind of really pushed the narrative that drugs are really going to send you over the edge, or that psychedelics are going to send you over the edge. And it's just simply not true. Like I said, they can cause auditory and visual hallucinations, but again, they're at very high doses. They require supervision when you're at that, but they can also cause very euphoric and peacefulness doses, euphoric and peacefulness mindset at low doses, and they can actually be taken in doses that are where they're undetectable to like your brain, where you're just basically not going to know it. Like I said, it operates more such as a ibuprofen or a Tylenol kind of working in the background. They can change perception, how you perceive people and objects, and also change your sensory. They do have lasting effects. Mushrooms can have, depending on the dose and the person and how they're taken and the setting, can have effects that oftentimes last multiple days after taking them. That's typically with a macro dose. But the effects are known to last for days, if not weeks after use. Laura, you talked about microdosing. Some of the stuff involved with microdosing is when people will take, so an effective dose of mushrooms is about 100 milligrams of dried mushroom. When people do a microdose, they'll typically do what would be about a 250 to 300 or 250 to a 500 milligram dose of mushrooms. And depending on their body size, their weight, their mindset, their metabolism, it is going to depend on how that affects the way that they feel. A lot of that is there's new studies are kind of going into creating a dosage system based on body weight and size to help kind of narrow an effective dose in and help kind of standardize what we should be doing with certain people. Mushrooms can be used to treat anxiety, depression, end-of-life mood disorders. They've been recent times, a lot of that's been being used for people that are in hospice or they have terminal cancer, and these patients kind of struggle with depression or like just the fact that they're coming to the end of their life. And mushrooms have been very effective in helping a lot of these individuals deal with that and come to grips with what's going on with them, what's going on with their body, and what's going on with their mind, and treating some of this and becoming more at ease with their end of life as they continue down their end of life process. We can take them. There's tons of different ways we can take them. We can now, as they become more popular, mushrooms are not great. They're to taste, to just take. So a lot of people will make teas out of them, and more recently now they're being baked into chocolates, or gummy bears, or different forms of gummies, and or they're just being ground up and then put into capsules and just swallowed like a regular pill. The reason a lot of them are becoming put into chocolates and gummies and capsules is so that they can be more effectively dosed, and they can be weighed out, and people know more what they're getting, and they can take a more zeroed in dosage as opposed to just grabbing a handful of mushrooms and chomping down on them. So one of the things I did want to talk about is, so the research bill that we got done, that research bill was specifically for whole mushroom psilocybin. So when you're something to bring up is when you're reading about studies, if you're doing research online, a lot of all of the studies that are being done online are being done with what they call a synthetic psilocybin. It's a synthesized psilocybin known as, its chemical derivative is 4-ACO-DMT. So 4-ACO-DMT is what they call the synthetic psilocybin. That's what all your tests are being done with. So this study that got approved by the state of Arizona is for whole mushroom psilocybin. And I'll tell you the difference and why why they want to study whole mushroom psilocybin as opposed to the synthetic psilocybin. So research is being done primarily on synthetic psilocybin because whole mushroom psilocybin is still an agricultural product. And just like any agricultural product, you can't I don't have a better word, but I guess exactify the dosage. So every mushroom within a crop, if you will, or what they call a flush, every mushroom in there will have just a slightly different amount of psilocybin. And so it makes research from a medical standpoint or from just a scientific standpoint much more difficult, because the dosages can vary 10 to 20%, not only per mushroom, or not only per the crop or flush, but per mushroom in that. So when researchers are doing it, researchers don't like that variance because it makes it harder to get exact data. It makes it harder to get verifiable data and reproducible data. However, Dr. Sisley, she runs the Scottsdale Research Institute. And her theory is that, and she's done a lot of laboratory work in this, is when you extract the psilocybin or you synthesize psilocybin into this other chemical, there's a lot of other little natural tryptamines that don't come along with that. So yes, you're getting the whole chemical of the psilocin or the whole chemical of the psilocybin, but if you do like a chromatography test on mushrooms specifically, there's all these little tryptamines that show up in the test. And when you synthesize it, all those little tryptamines disappear and they go away. And her theory is that all those little tryptamines contribute to the whole effect of the drug. And that when you synthesize it, you remove out some of that, and that the drug itself needs to have all those to work effectively. They tried a lot of this stuff with marijuana as well, and they had the same issue there where they tried to create a medical marijuana called Marinol, and you strip out all the small cannabinoids that are maybe not major, but they work in unison with each other to reduce the end effect. So when you'll have synthetic marijuana that doesn't have the same effects as real marijuana because it's eliminated all these little parts of it that work in synergy with each other. It's the same thing with mushrooms. You have all these little parts that aren't being taken when they synthesize it. Again, this makes it harder to do. This makes scientists or researchers a little more hesitant to work on that product because of that reason. So that's kind of the debate that's going on now. So that's why Dr. Sisley wanted to perform the study, see if she could get similar results or better results from it, and make a case for whole mushroom psilocybin to be used for treatment. I personally agree with Dr. Sisley. That's my personal opinion. I understand the downsides to performing tests on something that can vary 10 to 15% per product per each unit, but I think it's important. I think that's the part of that makes the whole thing work. So there's obviously needs to be more research done on that. So the best thing about psychedelics in general, and especially is from an addiction standpoint, which is something that comes up a lot in our legislative talks. Mushrooms, there's no documentation, there's no research that's shown that mushrooms have an addiction potential. They're neither physically addicting nor psychologically addictive, or at least nothing that we have been able to come up with so far. And in fact, they're typically used to help overcome addiction and addiction issues with folks. So not only not addictive, they help overcome addiction as for people that have addiction issues. So, did anybody have any questions about mushrooms at all, or any other questions that maybe wanted to bring up? I feel like I'm just rambling on here. George?
George, you're muted.
I think you're muted, George.
We can't hear you. It says you're not muted, but we're not hearing you. Maybe it's something with your headphone. Not hearing you. You show as being unmuted, George, but we are not hearing you. And I know when the meeting started before we got going, you were able to be heard. Can't hear you. While George is trying to figure that out, does anybody else have any questions or comments so far?
I had a question. So basically, I guess what I'm understanding is that we are asking for more research to be done. So does that mean we're kind of like in the research stage, and how long does that last?
Very much in the research phase. And states throughout the country there's a lot of bills that have been going on, being pushed through for research throughout the country. Arizona is one of the few that has actually pushed and made research available. I don't have the exact number of states, but I would say there's probably state funded research is probably a couple, maybe 2 to 3 states throughout the country that have state-funded research. There's other studies going on through private funding and research funding. But yes, we are very much in the research phase. There's a lot of research that needs to be done. What makes research difficult is these drugs are classified as Schedule 1. And so when a drug is classified as Schedule 1, the FDA, there's a lot more hoops to jump through in order to get studies approved by the FDA. Because if the Schedule 1 drug is basically it's considered useless in the mind of the government. There's no effective use for it. Considered purely a street drug that has no benefit. So in this case, like mushrooms are classified the same as heroin, which are obviously very different drugs. And so just the Schedule 1 makes it hard. That's why there's been a big push at the federal level to reschedule these drugs to a lower schedule to open up research, make research more available. Not only also that, when they're Schedule 1, the research becomes more expensive because there's more documentation that needs to be done. There's more guardrails that need to kind of be put in place for that. As far as moving things forward, the good thing is the government, both at the state level and the federal level, seems very open to at least hearing about research and hearing about these drugs. And as of the last really year and a half, there seems to be a big push from a lot of congressional folks at the federal level to push psychedelic research forward. And that's also gaining a lot of steam at the state level as well. So even though we're kind of in the early stages of research, there's a lot of push from people to get research going. More so, in fact, than a lot of, more so than like cannabis and things like that, that I feel like a lot of people may have felt like they were a little bit burned by cannabis, but research is being pushed forward. And yeah, we are in the earliest stages. And talking about, so as far as getting anything like made available, I would say it's going to take at least another 5 years of research before we start seeing really anything becoming available to the general public. I would say that's at a minimum, and I'd say that's at a minimum. I could also say I could be very wrong on that, but from what I've known and in discussing things with legislators and researchers, that's kind of the thing that would be about 5 years that people would be able to get into some kind of treatment without being in part of a research program.
And that's including like clinics as well, because I know our medical director was doing hours and hours and hours of training on this when he thought it was a possibility this year. So I should just tell him stop training.
So the other bill, SB 1570, I believe, I have the numbers wrong, we actually helped squash this bill. This was a bill that we initially supported in Arizona. It was to legalize psilocybin clinics that would have made psilocybin clinics available in the state of Arizona by 2026. That bill was not written by us. It was not proposed by us. It was sponsored by Senator Shope, who is the president tempore of the Senate in Arizona, and then co-sponsored by, I can't think of the name off the top of my head, but he's the president of the Senate. That bill essentially legalize psilocybin clinics. So what you were talking about, it'd make psilocybin clinics no different than go in, receive treatment. The guidelines for that hadn't been set yet. The education for clinicians hadn't been set yet. So the main reason that our group, Citizens for Psychedelics, pushed against that was because of that. There's been not nearly enough research done in this yet. There was no qualifying conditions that needed to be met in order to receive mushrooms. So basically, anybody could walk in without a condition and get treatment, which we just felt like was opening it up to more of a recreational situation, which we didn't want. There was no age limit, which meant that kids, essentially people could, teenagers could come in and say, I want to get this. I don't know how, there was no rules or safeguards put in place for that. So that was an issue that we addressed that didn't get changed. And it also basically made it so that whole system would run through one individual in the state, and that one individual would have control over how things were done. He was going to be able to appoint members of the board. He was going to be able to appoint advisors for it. It was all going to be people that he essentially could put in place to run it the way he wanted it to be run, with little kind of state input. So we just felt like that was not just a terrible situation, to be honest with you. And so that's why we killed that. So as far as the state of Arizona, there's nothing on the board or nothing in the works right now for a future psilocybin clinic bill. So I would say the earliest that would go into place at this point would be probably 2027, 2028. In addition, the governor has really kind of spoken out against putting any kind of that legislation forward at this time. And reason being is there's just not enough research in place yet. And putting something out to the public that hasn't been thoroughly researched just doesn't make sense, especially when it comes to the mental health of the community. So
Andrew, I have a question. When you look at studies, and my question is, could a clinic such as where Nicole works, where you've already got a psychiatrist who's interested in this, can they be part of this study with patients they see who volunteer? Is that an option?
So like a clinic like the one Nicole's at could, and that's where I go back to the Biomedical Research Board. If Nicole's clinic is set up to perform a study that can be FDA approved, if they go through the process of setting up that study, they can apply for this grant money through the state and create their own study and perform their own study out of their clinic. So, and I can put you in touch if that's something you're interested in pushing for, or at least getting some answers for on how that process works. I can put you in touch with some folks that can kind of guide you on what that process looks like and how to get involved in that too.
I think we would definitely be interested in looking at that, because I did speak to someone at one point. I think it was one of the doctors that was kind of overseeing it, and she said it was a couple $1 million to get a part of the study. And I was like, I didn't know if that grant money would help cover that or no.
That's exactly what that grant money is for. So again, I don't know all the exact details, but that's what that grant money is specifically for, is to fund
Nice.
that. Now applying for that's why I said I don't know how the process for applying for it. You can get on the AZ Biomedical Research Board, and I'll send a link to that in the document and that'll kind of lay out some of the process there. It also have the links to their meetings that they hold monthly. And I think they just switched it to bi-monthly now, so it's every other month. But yeah, I can get you in touch with the proper people
I
to
appreciate that.
at least get more information that I don't have.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I'm just gonna take some notes real quick.
George had a question. He put in chat, how about the $5 million cut from the adopted state budget?
That's been 4 million of that has been awarded. That's kind of what we had talked about with the SB or HB 2105. Sorry, I'm going to murder those numbers. They all kind of run together. But that's that 5 million, 4 million of it has been awarded. Like I said, discussed research, and then $1 million of it to University of Arizona. And then there's still 1 million left of that they just voted on Tuesday to continue to hand out as long as people
Okay.
can present a research program that meets the qualifications.
Thank you. Any other questions from anybody at this point? Okay.
So the next one that I like to talk about is LSD, or its technical name was lysergic acid diethylamide. Some people might know it as acid, or a dozen other weird street names that people like to call it. But I think everybody pretty much is familiar with LSD or acid. I think acid is a really terrible name for a drug that we're trying to push forward for therapy, but I guess we can work on it later. So LSD works basically the same as psilocybin does. It binds to the 5-HT receptors, affects mood, cognition, and perception. It does it a little different through some different chemical processes. I didn't really put any of those in here. A scientist, and I don't want to provide information that I can't guarantee is accurate. So it was first synthesized in 1938 by Albert Hofmann. That's the same Albert Hofmann that synthesized or not discovered, but named psilocybin as a chemical in mushrooms that becomes hallucinogenic. This is actually really an interesting story with Albert Hofmann. He was doing some studies with LSD, with a different version of LSD in relation to working with pregnancy and helping with stopping blood loss after pregnancy in women in the uterus. And so I was doing some work with this, accidentally got some on his skin. So LSD will absorb through the skin, whether it be in your mouth, but it'll also absorb just through handling it. And LSD is a very, very, very potent drug and has very strong effects in very small doses, where a microdose for mushrooms can be considered up to 100 milligrams. A micro or a macro dose for LSD would be 100 micrograms. So 1/1000th of the dose of psilocybin. So it's very strong. He was working with it, got it on his skin, started to feel weird, obviously, and told his assistant that he needed to go home. He wasn't feeling well, and that he wanted her to go with him to make sure that he made it home okay. And kind of the story goes, he essentially got on his bike and raced home the whole time, which now they know it's because he was experiencing a LSD trip or hallucination on his ride home. Got home, had fits of laughter, had a psychedelic experience while laying in bed, and then woke up the next morning, felt fine. Kind of realized what had happened through some process of elimination, and realized that this drug that he was working on had these whole separate effects that he didn't understand or realize. And so started doing a bunch of studies started altering the study that he was working on and doing some different things, and realized what he had on his hand. And then started doing even kind of more bizarre experiments where he wanted to see, they hadn't established like a study protocol for it yet. It was something new. And so he would go around the laboratory and actually dose people unknowingly throughout the laboratory and then just kind of sit back and see how they would react. This is in the 30s, a different time. I don't know how much you'd get away. You'd probably end up in prison now for doing something like that. But yeah, but that was kind of like the way they did it. And he would do that, and then they would, observe and see what happened. He was able to work through some of this, figured it out, kind of honed in, was able to do some studies. They were able to get a patent on LSD in the 40s. There's a laboratory called Sandoz Labs. It's in Switzerland. They patented a drug named Delicid. And Delicid was actually used in psychotherapy throughout the 50s and 60s. It was used for about 15 years. before they quit using Delisted as a an additional medical treatment to mental health therapy. So they were very in tune with what this drug could be used for from the get-go. And there was a lot of preliminary studies done by Sandoz and a couple other small laboratories in Switzerland with this, and then throughout Europe as well, in using it in mental health therapy. And then what the real reason that it's kind of an interesting story why LSD why LSD went away. And it's sort of a nefarious reason, to be honest with you. So Sandoz is doing all these research, and then this was kind of during the 60s, it became the height of the Cold War, and Russia and the US were in this race to spy on each other and one up each other. And that's where through a long, weird drug policy story that of post-World War II Germany. But the CIA ended up realizing that this created hallucinations and things of that nature. And they went to Sandoz Labs and essentially bought up all of the LSD that they had manufactured to that point, so that nobody else in the world could get it. Essentially, the CIA wanted the entire lot of it, and they were basically trying to keep it out of Russia's hands. And then they started performing their own experiments on this. Also, some of them like unknowingly being, to unknowing characters and things like that. So there's a lot of famous things that the CIA did with this. None of them with LSD. None of them are good or positive. That was all used for very negative reasons and done in a very negative way. But it also ultimately led to its outlaw ban, and then its ultimate rescheduling to a Schedule 1, not only with the United States, but throughout the world and the UN. The UN classified it later as a drug that should be monitored and not distributed. So that was essentially the end of LSD as a pharmaceutical drug or a research drug or anything to be used within the psychotherapy world. And that all ended pretty much in the 60s. There was some ongoing studies that lasted into the 80s. And then, like it says here, it was last used in Switzerland in 93. And that basically came down to pressure from the UN and other countries to essentially join the list of people that just didn't want it. And studies had all but stopped. Government stopped giving money to it to study it. And so that's where its use kind of ended at that point, which my opinion is very sad. We were well on our way to, getting not getting it figured out, but using it for something positive and continue to do studies. And really all we've done is set ourselves back 50 years in research. So, yeah. Effects of LSD are essentially the same as psilocybin. Can cause auditory visual hallucinations, distortions. This is the hallucinations happen at much lower doses with LSD, like we talked about, but a lot of the same feelings: euphoria, peacefulness. They're not all positive. They can cause paranoia. They can cause confusion, drowsiness. Again, it's all about the dose you take. It can be affected by your mood, your mindset. It can be affected by the environment that you're in, like down to the room you're in, the temperature. And most of that's all brought on by high doses. Like Lori had talked about, with microdoses, a lot of these things just don't happen just because the drug operates in the background. So some of the things that they've been used to treat drug addiction, particularly alcoholism, they've been successful. And then another one that recently come out, I met a gentleman from New York that's been working with New York firefighters with some of the stuff that they've been dealing with such as cluster headaches, which is a thing that they're affected by. A lot of guys from post 9/11 have been dealing with that, post 9/11 firefighters. Another recent study that's come up is reducing symptoms of Alzheimer's, and maybe even starting to reverse some of the effects of Alzheimer's, allowing people that are in later stages to be more lucid and aware of their surroundings. And then again, end of life, mood and pain disorders as well. LSD is typically taken on a piece of paper or a gel or in a sugar cube. It can also be dropped into a drink. It's essentially it's a powder diluted into a liquid, then transported to some other mode of ingestion. So, and then again, it's neither physically or psychologically addicting. There's been no studies or information to this point that shows that it's to the contrary. So as far when you talk about mental health treatments or medicine for mental health treatments, another reason that it makes it so promising is because it doesn't lead to other addiction issues or other dependency issues or make the brain reliant on it in some other way. So, which, as many of you know, probably like things like SSRIs and things to this nature can be very damaging and addictive and not great on the brain for long-term usage. Does anybody have any questions about LSD? All right. So this is another one I wanted to talk about, and then I don't have a whole lot. I have a couple other things, but I don't have a whole lot after this. But this is one that you probably have never heard of, and probably that you won't really hear of. And when it comes to mainstream treatments using psychedelics, this is a relatively new it's not relatively new as far as its existence. It's just relatively new as being studied. It's called ibogaine. Again, another natural substance. It's found in the iboga shrub from Africa. Again, it acts on those 5-HT receptors. This one acts a little differently and is a little more aggressive. It's been being used by pygmy tribes throughout Africa for hundreds of years, if not thousands. But the problem with ibogaine is it has a lot more side effects on the body from a physical standpoint. It's very effective in its use in addiction, but there's a lot of concerns over how it reacts in the body. When it comes to your heart, it has a lot of issues with potassium uptake, which can affect the heart's beat and rhythm, can cause heart stoppings. There have been about 30 deaths associated with ibogaine use, and every bit of research that I've done associates those 30 deaths with unsupervised and large scale use, or like large amounts per dose. The general theory is that it was dialed in and used more in a clinical setting, that those issues would go away. But because there are those issues and because they are known, there's not a lot of people that are willing to do studies on this drug, because it just, when you go into it and you already know that there's going to be heart issues or things to that nature, people kind of shy away from it, especially when it comes to a drug like an alternative drug. So there's not a lot of studies that have been done in the United States. There are studies that have been done a lot in New Zealand and Mexico, parts of Europe. And there are ibogaine clinics in a lot of those places as well. Especially in New Zealand, there's a very big, very well-known ibogaine clinic. Ibogaine works incredibly well with addiction, it's particularly opioid addiction. I don't know all the science of why it works so well with addiction. The theory is that it works a lot with guilt in the brain and how people perceive guilt upon themselves, which a lot of addiction is surrounded by guilt or is brought on by guilt, and how people perceive themselves and actions that they've done in the past. So during an ibogaine hallucination or an ibogaine journey, you get a lot of the same things of like hallucinations, things like that. Again, with ibogaine, makes it less likely or less desirable hallucinogenic is because it does cause nausea and vomiting, and some people like extreme cases of nausea and vomiting where they're just almost projectile vomiting. That's for a period of time. Then you go into a different state where you'll be like in a dreamlike hallucination where you're kind of like almost like an out-of-body experience type deal. And then you'll go into what they call like an introspective phase where you start reflecting and basically do like an inventory. They call it like a self-inventory of your life, where you kind of recap things in your life. And I think that's where a lot of the stuff of dealing with guilt are improved, and your thought process on how guilt is processed and things like that come to that. The other reason is ibogaine is a commitment if you're going to take it. Hallucinations can last up to 24 hours, which is a long time for somebody to be hallucinating and dealing with traumatic events in their past and things. So again, it's not one for everyone. It's not a very popular one, but the reason I like ibogaine so much is it's incredibly effective with addiction treatment. There's studies that range at anywhere from the people that were addicted to alcohol or cocaine or heroin, and there's stories of heavy one-time ibogaine dose, and they never touch these substances again. They've done studies where it lengthens the time of recidivism for alcoholics, from like where they'll take a dose, or at a comparative study, there was a placebo group and an ibogaine group. The placebo group backslid into drinking on about 6-7 months, but the group that took ibogaine, then backslid into drinking over a period of 9 to 12 months. So even though they did revert back to use, it was on the success and the length of time that they were abstinent from that substance was much longer. And then again, with opioids, particularly with opioids, they interact with a lot of the same receptors that opioids target. And so I think my theory is that's the reason they're just more effective with opioids. They're blocking some kind of opioid uptake in there. Again, not a lot of studies done with ibogaine to this point, but I think it warrants a lot more study, especially when it comes to drug addiction treatment. One of the things that we're pushing for as Citizens for Psychedelics is the state of Arizona received a large sum of money in regards to the opioid settlement and the opioid pandemic. We're trying to get some of those. They have to use that money for opioid abatement or opioid research or keeping people off of opioids. So what we're trying to get the Attorney General to do is to set aside some more money for research within psychedelics, primarily with ibogaine, but all psychedelics, and see if we can get some more money available to researchers for psychedelics to help combat opioid abuse. And that's why I like ibogaine, because it is so effective in that drug for the treatment of that addiction. So,
And Andrew, did you say how concentrated that is?
it's fairly concentrated as well. I don't know doses. Here, give me a second. It's you can use it in very small doses. I don't know what the typical usage dose. Are you seeing all my screen right now?
No,
Are
we're
you
just
still seeing the
PowerPoint. We're just seeing the PowerPoint. Yeah, that's okay. I just wondered, because when you're dealing with the natural plants and the biology of the plant, the variation and that, and you mentioned how much stronger the LSD was to the mushrooms. I just wondered where this fell in with that.
Yeah. I'm gonna look at something real quick before we move on. Yeah, so nothing that I can see really gives like an effective dose in the information that I kind of have. But so yeah, as I said, I'm not ibogaine is a lot harder to find information on just because it isn't so widespread studied. But I can get that and I can find out. Now I want to find out just for my own use. So but it's taken the same way as mushrooms, typically in a tea or in a capsule. So I'd imagine similar dose sizing. Where did they go? All right. And then so to Oops, misspelled that. Oh, I misspelled it. So we can move on to the dissociatives, and Nicole may know some more about these than I do, since she works in this. But really, in my opinion, the only dissociative that's worth really talking about is ketamine. The rest of them don't have enough studies done on them. They don't have enough research done on them. I think they have too many side effects that go along with them, and can just be too dangerous for public use without very close supervision. As far as psychedelics or quote unquote psychedelics go, ketamine is the most researched one, which makes complete sense because it's also the only one that's approved for real pharmaceuticals. So it's probably had 15, 20 years of study done on it from pharmaceutical companies, medical doctors, laboratories, clinics, like the one Nicole works at, and things of that. It was developed in the 60s. It's primarily used as an anesthetic in surgeries, really. And then through the way they found out that it could be used for other things such as mental health therapy was when they were using it for kind of like twilight surgeries where the patient is half in and half out. Patients were complaining of unwanted hallucinations and unwanted visual distortions during the process. So that's when it opened it up to more study to be used as an alternative medicine. They use ketamine in that you can, right? Currently, as we speak, ketamine you can go to the clinic like Nicole works at, or there's probably a dozen or two others throughout the state. And they're using it as an off-label, what they call an off-label use. It's incredibly common with drugs. There's a lot of drugs that we use for certain things that weren't intended to be used. They do it all the time. So that's kind of what they're doing here. It's not intended to be used as a mental health treatment, but they've discovered that it can be, and that there's some positives to it. And the FDA hasn't come in and shut it down for that use. It was rescheduled to I believe it's a Schedule 1. It may be a Schedule 2 drug. It was rescheduled in 1999, and mostly due to the fact that it was being used as a party drug or a club drug. I've done ketamine, and I don't know why anybody would think that it's a party drug. It does not seem like something very fun to use recreationally. I think it has its uses from a mental health standpoint, and people have had a lot of benefits from it. But it's just not one that we at Citizens for Psychedelics talk about generally, or push for. And part of the reason is it's already approved for use, and so people can go to it and get clinics, and so there's no need to push for further legalization. I think it can definitely be researched more, and I think that research is taking place, and I just don't think that it needs Citizens for Psychedelics help with that. So yeah. So that kind of covers the gambit of all the drugs that we kind of talk about and are kind of in the mainstream of what's being pushed right now for mental health treatments or various other medical treatments with psychedelics. I think those are the kind of the big drugs that people are referring to. There are some other ones that I didn't talk about in here. Ones like MDMA, that's another one that's being pushed. I personally don't like MDMA as a therapeutic drug. I think it affects the serotonin levels in people's brains too much, and it also has negative effects on the heart, which is one of which is a thing that gets pushed back on with MDMA. MDMA is not what they considered a classic psychedelic. It's considered what they call an empathogen, which does exactly what it says, makes people feel more empathy, and more kind of like that lovey feeling. It's often kind of called the love drug. That's why it became popular as a party drug as well. So MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, which is the largest psychedelics advocacy group in the world. They really push MDMA. Rick Doblin, who's the CEO of that group, has been pushing for MDMA use in mental health therapy since the 80s, since the early 80s. And they've recently been able to put in front of Congress to get that drug, have that drug approved for therapeutic use. It's currently sitting in front of the FDA. The FDA, there was a board at the FDA that gave a negative review and recommended that it not be pushed further forward for research. But as far as I can tell, and as far as what's being said, the FDA is going to push that drug forward and make it more available for therapeutic use. There's an emergency kind of board that's been put together within Congress and with the FDA to evaluate that. And it looks, all signs kind of point to that's going to be pushed forward, and that'll be made available for therapeutic use. And you'll be able to get that like at Nicole's clinic if the state ratifies that and puts things in place for that, then Nicole will be able to use MDMA at her clinic for studies or for therapeutic use. I don't know the exact timelines for that, but I would imagine it's going to be within the next year that you'll see MDMA available in clinics and in different doctors' facilities. There was a bill put through in this last legislation in the state of Arizona that they preemptively put MDMA on the list of drugs, basically saying that once the federal government makes it legal to use for therapeutic use, that the state of Arizona will make it legal for therapeutic use. So that's already been it's been approved by the legislature. And so as soon as the federal government makes that decision, then the state will follow suit automatically on that. So like I said, we could see the use of MDMA in clinical setting as early as the end of the year. So again, it's my opinion, I think it needs some more study done on it. There is a lot out there, but my personal belief is I'm not a fan. I don't like the way that it overproduces serotonin. I think it has too many negative potential health effects. But that's my opinion on that.
So we have a question back to the ketamine. George was wondering about its use as a chemical restraint by police. You said it was used as an anesthetic. Is there any discussion around that or not?
I've never heard it being used in that manner. It does take a while. It doesn't take a long time to kick in, but it takes longer to activate than I would think that it would make sense for something for the police to use. But I could be wrong on that too. Nicole may be able to provide more insight on that, but that's my personal feeling on it.
I haven't heard that either.
Oh, okay, thank you.
And I personally am not a fan of cops really providing much of anything other than safety.
Yeah.
Securing our safety. But I would rather things get left to the medical professionals.
Yes.
My opinion. All right. So if nobody had any other questions, I'd kind of get into some other things that we were doing and kind of where the state of research and legalities are coming along, if everybody's ready for that.
Looks like they're ready.
Perfect. So most of what Citizens for Psychedelics is doing is we're doing a couple of things. Really, we're pushing for public education and we're pushing for legislative education, informing our legislators of why we want this, the potential that it has, and getting research in front of them, and then creating legislative reform when it's appropriate. For us, we spend a lot of time talking to legislators about this subject. We've been doing that essentially since the week we started. When I finally sat down and decided to give this a go and start pushing for this, within 4 days, we were sitting in front of legislators. We were sitting in front of Representative Payne, in front of Senator Shope, talking about this. So we spend a lot of time sitting in front of the legislation. We do a lot of talk in front of the legislation at hearings. If you've been to any of these, you've probably seen us speaking up there. Our biggest thing is making sure that legislators are making decisions based on factual information, and that they have the information in front of them, that the research that they have in front of them is accurate and can be verified, and that they're looking at it in the proper manner. Another thing that we want to make sure they're educating them so that they can also help push for research. The biggest thing for us is research. We want to make sure that all the research gets done that we need to get done. The last thing that our society needs is for us to rush through another drug or another substance and put it out in the ether for the people to consume or use, whether that's, for mental health therapy or any other reason. But whatever gets put out into the public, we should need to make sure that we have all the data, or at least enough data on it, to show that it's safe, to show that we're not putting our community at danger, to show that we're not putting our mental health community in danger. So the biggest thing for us is pushing for research. That's why we pushed for the 5 million. That's why we're going to continue to push for opioid dollars to be put towards research. We just want to make sure that we're covering all of our bases when it comes to these substances. And so we want to make sure that all that gets taken into account as we do legislation. So like I said, we're Citizens for Psychedelics is currently working on some legislation to get more research available, to get more money available, and continue to push down that road. The other one is to educate the public. We do want to do meetings like this. This is one of our first ones that we've gotten involved with. Since being invited by you, Lori, we've been able to do this for a couple other organizations, get appointments set up to speak to some other people. So we're very appreciative that you've allowed us to come and kind of talk to your group about psychedelics and what they're doing and why we want to push them forward. So I appreciate that. There's just a lot of information that people don't know out there. When I first got into this, I thought it seemed like every day I thought I'd learned everything I could know about psychedelics. Every day I realized how just far from the truth that is. There's a ton of information out there. There's a ton of research that needs to be done. And there's also just, a lot of times the public just doesn't know where to look. And so if we can put information that if we let the public, or if the public lets us do all the research and fact finding, we'll make sure that it gets out to the public and they can make informed decisions on what their opinion is, whether it's good or bad. And we want to make sure we're putting information out there that's good and bad. The biggest thing is that we're not painting a rose colored glasses photo of what psychedelics can do. We think that there's potential, and we think that deems more research. And if it turns out through research that it's not a viable or effective method to treat mental health problems, then we don't want to put it out there. But with all the positive preliminary research that's going on, we think that it warrants more research, and we're going to keep pushing for that until everyone is satisfied that we've covered all our bases.
We got just a few more minutes.
Okay, I got one more slide. That's it. So, like I said, the biggest thing is public education and gathering data. Data is key to educating everyone. And if we can get that in everyone's hands, then we're good. And then I'll leave you with this. The last thing is that psychedelics aren't for everyone. We know that. We know they're not going to treat everyone. We know they're not going to solve everyone's problems, but we do want to make them available for the people that want to try them out and think that they can have a good use. The other thing that we want to make sure that we're putting out there before is that it's not a magic pill. It's really frustrating from our standpoint when everybody, you see this in social media and news and blah, blah, blah. And there's a lot of news stories that are like, mushrooms fix depression, ketamine fixes depression, LSD fixes it. And it's just not true. They're not a magic pill. It's not this one instance isn't going to fix everything. This one pill isn't going to fix everything. They need to be combined with existing mental health therapy. They need to make sure they're regulated appropriately. They need to make sure that their people are being treated through qualified therapists that are familiar with these treatments, that are familiar with what they do and how they affect the brain. And so again, not only not for everybody, it's not going to fix everything, and we know that, but we want to make it available to whoever wants to at least try it and see if it can fix them or help with their issues. And it's going to require a new way of thinking to get to there. So that's all I have. I appreciate you letting me speak. I hope I didn't ramble on too much, and I hope that it was somewhat informative.
Very informative, and I think that we really appreciate the approach and all the ground that you're covering. And on behalf of NAMI Yavapai and the Northern Arizona Peer and Family Coalition, we really thank you. I'm seeing in the chat, this has been really helpful for a lot of folks. So again, thank you for the work you're doing and getting the information out there.
Yeah, no worries at all. We enjoy what we're doing. We enjoy educating the public about it, and we'll just keep pushing forward. And yeah, if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out through Lori. I'll send a kind of a document out to you, Lori, later today, and it'll have a bunch of links to organizations that folks can go to that are in the current, that keep current with the current research and everything like that. So you guys have some links to go look at if you want to. So